For 15 years, the people who walked through the front doors of Ashford National Bank believed they knew exactly who he was. Every weekday, before the sun had fully climbed above the skyline, an elderly man wearing a faded military jacket would quietly take his place on the same weathered bench across the street. His beard had turned silver years ago. His boots were worn from countless miles. His hands, scarred by time and hard work, rested calmly on an old wooden cane. Most people never looked at him twice. Some assumed he was homeless. Others believed he was waiting for handouts he never asked for. Parents pulled their children a little closer as they walked past. Office workers hurried by without making eye contact. Even the bank's security guards had grown so accustomed to seeing him that he had become part of the scenery, almost as ordinary as the streetlights and traffic signals surrounding the building. Day after day, season after season, William Hayes sat in the same place, watching people rush toward lives that never seemed to have enough time for one another. No one wondered why he always arrived before the bank opened. No one questioned why he never begged, never complained, and never accepted money from strangers. They simply believed they already knew his story. They couldn't have been more wrong. Then, on a cold, rain-soaked Tuesday morning, something happened that stopped an entire city block in its tracks. As employees hurried inside with coffee in one hand and briefcases in the other, a sleek black luxury SUV pulled quietly to the curb in front of the bank. Conversations faded. The driver stepped out first, followed by a sharply dressed businessman whose face appeared regularly in financial magazines and television interviews. The bank manager rushed outside, convinced the powerful executive had arrived for an important meeting. Employees straightened their jackets. Security opened the front entrance. But instead of walking toward the bank, the businessman crossed the sidewalk without hesitation and approached the old veteran sitting alone on the bench. Then, in full view of everyone watching, he stood perfectly still, raised his right hand, and delivered a crisp military salute. Without saying a word, William Hayes slowly returned the salute with quiet dignity. The street fell silent. No one understood what they were witnessing. The businessman reached into his pocket, removed a small envelope, handed it respectfully to the old veteran, and nodded before walking away. He never entered the bank. He climbed back into the waiting SUV, and within seconds, the vehicle disappeared into traffic, leaving behind dozens of stunned witnesses searching for answers that none of them had. Who was William Hayes? Why would one of the country's most respected business leaders salute a man everyone else ignored? Why had this elderly veteran chosen to sit outside the same bank every single day for nearly 15 years without asking anyone for help? And perhaps the most astonishing question of all was this: if William truly was homeless, how could someone with that level of influence know him personally? Those questions spread through the bank before the morning had even begun. Employees whispered in break rooms. Customers speculated while standing in line. Even the security guards who believed they knew everything about the quiet old man suddenly realized they knew absolutely nothing. What none of them could possibly imagine was that William Hayes wasn't protecting a secret about his past. He was protecting a secret about the building standing directly across the street. A secret that had remained hidden for decades. A secret worth millions of dollars. And before this story was over, every person who had ever judged the old veteran by his appearance would be forced to confront a truth that would change the way they looked at people forever. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The mystery surrounding William Hayes only grew deeper over the following days. Inside Ashford National Bank, productivity slowed as employees found themselves watching the old veteran through the front windows whenever they had a spare moment. Customers who had never noticed him before now stopped to look across the street, wondering whether they were standing just a few yards away from a man whose story had somehow remained hidden for nearly 15 years. Richard Collins instructed his staff not to spread rumors, but even he couldn't ignore what had happened. He requested security footage from previous months, hoping to understand whether William's daily routine revealed something everyone else had overlooked. Hour after hour, the recordings showed exactly the same pattern. William Hayes always arrived at precisely 7:15 each morning. He sat on the same weathered bench, facing the entrance of the bank. Around noon, he would slowly walk across the street, purchase a cup of black coffee from a small family-owned cafe, return to the bench, and quietly continue watching the building. Shortly before sunset, he would stand, gently tap his cane against the sidewalk twice, and leave without speaking to anyone unless someone greeted him first. There were no unusual visitors, no suspicious behavior, no signs that he was waiting for money or assistance. It was as though he were carrying out a responsibility known only to himself. Emily Brooks couldn't stop thinking about William's words. Some promises are too important to break. The sentence echoed in her mind every time she looked outside. She began asking longtime employees whether anyone knew when William first appeared. An elderly maintenance worker named Harold Benson remembered seeing him years before Emily had joined the bank. According to Harold, William had started sitting outside shortly after the bank completed a major renovation more than a decade earlier. At first, everyone assumed he was waiting for someone inside. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Eventually, people stopped asking questions because William never caused trouble. He never asked for favors, never raised his voice, and never stepped inside the building. Harold recalled one strange detail that suddenly seemed important. Every year, on the exact same date, William arrived carrying a single white rose. He would sit quietly all day, holding the flower in his hands before placing it gently near the front steps of the bank as he left. Nobody ever asked why. Most assumed it was connected to his military service. Now Emily wasn't convinced. The flower, the promise, the businessman, the mysterious envelope, none of it seemed accidental anymore. It all pointed toward a story that had remained carefully hidden for years. Meanwhile, William Hayes continued behaving as though nothing had changed. The curious stares no longer bothered him because he had grown accustomed to being misunderstood. He smiled politely when people greeted him and thanked those who offered him coffee, but he never explained himself. He simply watched the entrance of Ashford National Bank with the same calm patience he had displayed for years. What nobody realized was that William wasn't watching the people entering the building. He was remembering someone who no longer could. Every brick, every window, and every step leading to the front entrance reminded him of a promise he had made decades earlier. A promise born during one of the happiest seasons of his life and strengthened during one of the most heartbreaking. The building across the street wasn't just another bank to him. It represented a decision that had changed everything long before anyone inside the bank had ever heard his name. But before anyone could uncover the truth about why William Hayes refused to leave that bench, they would first have to understand the extraordinary life he lived before the world began calling him a homeless veteran. Because the man sitting quietly outside the bank had once worn a very different uniform, carried a very different responsibility, and made a choice that would shape the rest of his life in ways nobody could possibly imagine. Long before people knew William Hayes as the quiet old veteran sitting outside Ashford National Bank, he had been a young man whose life was built on duty, discipline, and unwavering loyalty. He grew up in a small farming town in western Pennsylvania, where values mattered more than possessions and a person's word carried more weight than a signed contract. William's father had served in the military, and from an early age he taught his son that true character revealed itself when nobody was watching. Those lessons stayed with William long after he enlisted in the United States Army. He served with distinction for more than 20 years, completing deployments that tested him physically and emotionally. During those years, he never spoke much about medals or recognition because he believed the greatest honor was bringing his fellow soldiers home safely. The men who served beside him remembered him as calm under pressure, dependable in impossible situations, and willing to risk everything for people he barely knew. When his military career finally ended, William returned home carrying more memories than possessions. He wasn't interested in fame or attention. He wanted something much simpler. He wanted a quiet life with the woman who had waited faithfully through every deployment. Her name was Margaret Hayes. She had stood beside William through the uncertainty of military life, writing letters during deployments and believing in him even when months passed without hearing his voice. Together, they dreamed of building a future filled with peace instead of conflict. Using William's military retirement, careful savings accumulated over decades, and a modest inheritance Margaret had received from her late parents, they began investing cautiously. They weren't chasing wealth. They wanted financial security and the opportunity to help others one day. Their biggest investment came when they purchased an aging commercial building in the downtown business district. At the time, few people thought much of the property. The neighborhood was struggling, businesses were leaving, and many investors believed the building had little future. But William and Margaret saw something different. They believed the community would eventually recover, and they wanted to become part of that future. After months of renovations and countless hours of work, the building was leased to what would eventually become Ashford National Bank. The rental income wasn't extravagant, but it gave them stability. More importantly, it gave them hope. Every month, William would smile as they reviewed the bank's lease payments, reminding Margaret that patience often rewarded people willing to think beyond the present. They never imagined that the very building standing across the street from that weathered bench would one day become the center of a mystery that would leave an entire city speechless. For several years, life unfolded exactly as they had hoped. William and Margaret built a modest but happy life together. They welcomed a son, Benjamin Hayes, whose laughter filled their home with a joy William had never experienced before. The future seemed brighter than ever. William devoted himself to his family, while continuing to manage the property and volunteer with local veterans organizations. Those who knew him described him as generous, humble, and deeply devoted to the people he loved. Then, without warning, everything changed. A devastating series of personal tragedies struck the Hayes family, one after another, leaving William carrying grief that few people could imagine. The confident veteran who had once planned every detail of his family's future slowly withdrew from the life he had built. Friends noticed the change, but no one truly understood the weight he was carrying. Over time, William disappeared from the circles where he had once been respected and admired. Years later, when people first noticed the elderly man sitting alone outside Ashford National Bank, they assumed they were looking at someone who had lost everything. In one sense, they were right. William Hayes had lost more than most people could endure. But what they failed to realize was that while tragedy had taken away the people he loved most, it had never taken away the promise he made to Margaret Hayes. And that promise was the reason he returned to the same bench every single day, guarding a secret that nobody, not even the executives inside the bank, could have imagined. The years that followed tested William Hayes in ways no battlefield ever had. Losing fellow soldiers during military service had taught him about sacrifice, but nothing prepared him for the pain of losing the people he loved most. It began with Benjamin Hayes, his only son. Benjamin had grown into a thoughtful young man who admired his father's discipline and his mother's kindness. He often accompanied William to inspect the commercial building leased to Ashford National Bank, learning about responsibility, honesty, and the importance of honoring every promise. William dreamed that one day Benjamin would take over the property and continue building the legacy he and Margaret Hayes had started together. But life had other plans. One rainy evening, while driving home from a volunteer event, Benjamin was involved in a tragic accident that claimed his life. The news shattered the Hayes family. William, a man who had remained calm during combat, found himself completely broken by a loss he could neither prevent nor understand. Margaret never fully recovered from the grief of losing their son. Although she tried to smile for William's sake, the light that had once filled her eyes slowly disappeared. Friends noticed she became quieter with each passing month, and William could only watch helplessly as the woman who had carried his heart for decades struggled beneath a weight neither of them knew how to lift. Several years later, William faced another devastating blow. Margaret Hayes became seriously ill. At first, she insisted it was nothing more than exhaustion, but medical tests revealed a condition far more serious than anyone expected. William devoted every waking moment to caring for her. He attended every appointment, managed every treatment, and remained by her side through long nights filled with uncertainty. During those difficult months, the commercial building and its rental income became almost meaningless to him. Money could not buy more time. Success could not erase fear. The only thing that mattered was keeping the promise he had made on their wedding day, to stand beside Margaret through every season of life. One afternoon, while looking out the hospital window toward the city skyline, Margaret quietly reached for William's hand and asked him to make one final promise. She reminded him how much they had loved watching people come and go from the bank after it opened years earlier. She spoke about the families who trusted the institution, the employees who depended on their jobs, and the community that had grown around the building. Then she asked him never to let greed destroy what they had built together. She wanted the building to remain a place that served ordinary people, not just another investment to be sold to the highest bidder. William looked into her eyes and promised he would protect it for as long as he lived. A few days later, Margaret Hayes passed away peacefully, leaving William alone with memories, heartbreak, and one promise that would define the rest of his life. After Margaret's death, William Hayes quietly disappeared from the successful life he had once known. He sold the large family home because it no longer felt like home without the laughter of Margaret and Benjamin. He donated many of his possessions to veterans organizations and local charities. Friends offered him places to stay, but William politely declined. He rented a small room on the edge of the city and chose to live simply, keeping only what he truly needed. To the outside world, his decision made little sense. People who had once known him gradually lost contact, and those who saw him sitting outside Ashford National Bank assumed tragedy had left him homeless and forgotten. William never corrected them. He wasn't interested in explaining himself or defending his choices. Every morning he returned to the weathered bench across from the bank, quietly honoring the promise he had made to Margaret Hayes. Unknown to everyone around him, he still owned the building. He still received lease payments through a private trust managed by an attorney, and he continued using much of that income to anonymously support veterans, widows, and families facing hardship. No one inside Ashford National Bank suspected that the elderly man they pitied was, in fact, the landlord whose signature appeared on documents kept inside the executive offices. But the carefully guarded secret was about to face its greatest challenge. Because forces far more powerful than rumors were beginning to circle the property, and a decision made inside the bank's boardroom would soon threaten the promise William Hayes had spent 15 years protecting. 15 years passed, and William Hayes became a familiar figure outside Ashford National Bank. New employees joined the company, senior executives retired, and thousands of customers came and went, yet the elderly veteran remained exactly where people expected to find him every morning. To most, he had become part of the neighborhood, someone people noticed without truly seeing. Some greeted him politely before rushing inside. Others avoided making eye contact altogether. A few customers quietly left coffee or sandwiches beside the bench, believing they were helping a lonely old man who had nowhere else to go. William always thanked them with genuine gratitude, but he never asked for anything. He never held out a cup. He never displayed a sign asking for money. He accepted kindness only when it was freely offered and often shared whatever food he received with other struggling people nearby. His quiet dignity confused those who paid close attention, but very few ever stopped long enough to ask why he returned to the same place day after day. Most people were too busy living their own lives to wonder about someone else's story. Inside the bank, opinions about William Hayes varied widely. Some employees viewed him as harmless. Others believed his daily presence created an uncomfortable impression for customers. Richard Collins occasionally received complaints from visitors who questioned why an elderly homeless veteran was allowed to remain outside the entrance. Although William never stepped onto bank property or disturbed anyone, a few executives argued that his presence affected the bank's professional image. Security officers were instructed to monitor him more closely, but after years of observation, every report reached the same conclusion. William Hayes never caused problems. He simply arrived, sat quietly, watched the building, and left before dark. Even so, several newly hired security guards approached him from time to time, politely suggesting he find another place to spend his day. William never argued. He would smile warmly, thank them for speaking respectfully, and quietly say, "I've been keeping a promise longer than you've been working here." The guards assumed the old veteran was speaking about military service and usually walked away, never realizing those simple words carried a meaning far greater than they imagined. Among everyone inside Ashford National Bank, one person refused to see William Hayes as an inconvenience. Emily Brooks, the young teller whose curiosity had grown stronger since witnessing the mysterious salute, continued speaking with him whenever her lunch break allowed. She noticed details that others ignored. William never complained about his circumstances. He remembered people's names even after meeting them only once. He often asked Emily about her family, her career goals, and whether she was taking care of herself during long workdays. Strangely, he never spoke about himself unless she asked direct questions, and even then, his answers remained brief. One afternoon, Emily handed him a fresh cup of coffee and quietly asked why he had never accepted money from anyone. William smiled gently before looking toward the bank entrance. "Because there are things more valuable than money," he replied. Emily waited for him to continue, but he simply took another sip of coffee. A few moments later, he added another sentence that would stay with her forever. "Never judge someone's final chapter by the clothes they're wearing. Most people see where a person is standing today. Very few ask where they've walked to get there." Emily couldn't explain why those words affected her so deeply, but she sensed they came from years of experience rather than simple wisdom. As weeks passed, Ashford National Bank's executive leadership faced increasing financial pressure. A national investment firm had expressed interest in purchasing the property occupied by the bank, along with several neighboring buildings, as part of a major downtown redevelopment project. The proposed deal promised enormous profits for investors and executives alike. During confidential board meetings, discussions became increasingly serious. If approved, the old bank building would be demolished and replaced with a modern high-rise office complex. To most people in the room, it was simply another business decision. But the announcement came on a quiet Monday morning, hidden inside what appeared to be an ordinary internal memo. Most employees barely glanced at it before returning to their work, but inside the executive offices of Ashford National Bank, the atmosphere was entirely different. Richard Collins and the members of the board had spent months negotiating with one of the country's largest commercial development firms. Their proposal promised to transform the entire downtown district into a modern business center filled with luxury offices, upscale restaurants, and premium retail space. To investors, it looked like the opportunity of a lifetime. To city officials, it represented economic growth. To the executives inside the boardroom, it promised promotions, bonuses, and national recognition. There was only one obstacle standing in the way. Before construction could begin, every existing lease agreement had to be terminated, and the building itself had to be purchased from its legal owner. Richard glanced through the documents confidently. According to the files, ownership was held by a private trust that had remained unchanged for decades. None of the executives seemed concerned. They assumed the owner would eagerly accept an offer worth several $million. After all, who would refuse such a fortune? They instructed the legal department to arrange a meeting immediately, expecting the paperwork to be completed within days. Unknown to everyone in the room, the person they were preparing to negotiate with was quietly sitting across the street, holding a warm cup of coffee and watching people hurry through the bank's front doors as he had done for nearly 15 years. Outside, William Hayes sensed that something had changed. Experience had taught him to recognize subtle differences in people's behavior. Employees moved with unusual urgency. Executives who rarely appeared together entered the building one after another. Expensive cars filled the reserved parking spaces throughout the morning. William quietly observed without asking questions. He didn't need to. Deep inside, he had known this day would eventually arrive. Years earlier, Margaret Hayes had predicted that one day someone would see the building not as part of a community, but as an opportunity to maximize profit. She had asked William to protect it for as long as he could, not because the bricks themselves mattered, but because the people inside did. The tellers raising young families, the maintenance workers nearing retirement, the customers who trusted the bank with their life savings. To Margaret, buildings were never simply investments. They became part of people's lives. As William sat on his weathered bench, his fingers gently traced the worn wedding ring he still carried in his pocket every single day. He quietly whispered, "I haven't forgotten my promise." Across the street, Emily Brooks noticed him through the window. Something about his expression caught her attention. William wasn't watching the building with sadness. He was watching it with quiet determination, as though he had been preparing for this exact moment longer than anyone else realized. Later that afternoon, the bank's legal department contacted the attorney managing the property's trust. They expected a routine conversation. Instead, they were politely informed that the trustee would only discuss the proposed sale after consulting directly with the property's beneficiary. Richard Collins found the response unusual but not alarming. He instructed his assistant to arrange a formal meeting later that week. Confident that everything was moving according to plan, the executives celebrated what they believed would soon become the largest transaction in the bank's history. None of them noticed William Hayes slowly standing from his bench before sunset, tapping his cane twice against the sidewalk, just as he had done every evening for years. As he turned to leave, Emily Brooks hurried outside, calling his name. She hesitated before asking the question that had been on her mind since the mysterious businessman saluted him. "Mr. Hayes, if the bank disappeared tomorrow, would you miss it?" William stopped walking. For a long moment, he looked back at the building where so much of his life had unfolded. Then he smiled gently and answered, "Some things are worth far more than money, Emily. The difficult part is finding people who still remember that." Without another word, he continued down the sidewalk, leaving Emily standing alone with a feeling she couldn't explain. What she didn't know was that within a matter of days, William Hayes would walk back into Ashford National Bank for the first time in 15 years, not as a customer, not as a visitor, and certainly not as the homeless veteran everyone believed him to be. He would enter as the man whose signature alone could decide the future of the entire building, and the truth waiting inside those legal documents would leave every executive in the room speechless. The meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock on Thursday morning. Inside the executive conference room of Ashford National Bank, the atmosphere was filled with confidence. Richard Collins sat at the head of the polished oak table alongside senior executives, corporate attorneys, and representatives from the development company that hoped to purchase the property. Presentation folders were neatly arranged in front of every chair. Architectural drawings covered one side of the room, displaying impressive images of the luxury office tower they planned to build after demolishing the existing bank. The projected profits reached into the tens of millions of dollars, and everyone expected the meeting to be little more than a formality. Richard even joked that by lunchtime the final obstacle would be behind them. The attorneys agreed. After all, the property belonged to a private trust. They assumed the beneficiary would gladly accept an offer that exceeded the building's market value. As the clock reached 9, the room fell silent. The legal assistant stepped inside and quietly announced that the property's attorney had arrived. Richard stood confidently, expecting to greet another businessman in an expensive suit. Instead, an elderly attorney named Charles Bennett entered carrying a slim leather briefcase. Behind him, walking slowly with the help of his worn wooden cane, came William Hayes. For several seconds, nobody moved. Richard Collins stared at the old veteran in disbelief. Several executives exchanged confused looks, convinced there had been some kind of mistake. One of the younger board members even whispered that security must have allowed the wrong person upstairs. William Hayes remained calm. He wore the same faded military jacket he had worn almost every day outside the bank, though it had been carefully cleaned and neatly buttoned. His boots showed years of wear, yet they were polished. His posture remained straight, carrying the unmistakable discipline of a soldier. Charles Bennett quietly pulled out a chair and invited William to sit at the head of the table opposite the executives. Confusion quickly turned into uncomfortable silence. Richard finally cleared his throat and politely asked whether there had been a misunderstanding. Charles opened his briefcase, removed several legal documents, and placed them carefully on the table. His voice remained calm as he spoke. "There has been no misunderstanding, Mr. Collins. Allow me to formally introduce Mr. William Hayes, sole beneficiary of the Hayes Family Trust and legal owner of this property, including the building currently occupied by Ashford National Bank." The room froze. Every executive instinctively looked toward William, searching his face for some sign that this was a joke. There wasn't one. Charles Bennett continued turning pages as he explained the history of the trust. Decades earlier, William Hayes and his late wife, Margaret Hayes, had purchased the property through careful investments, later placing it into the trust to protect it for future generations. Every lease renewal signed by Ashford National Bank over the past 15 years had required William's approval, although his attorney handled the administrative work to preserve his privacy. Richard Collins felt his heart sink as realization began to settle over the room. The elderly veteran they had ignored, the man customers pitted, the person some employees had quietly asked to move away from the entrance, was the individual whose signature determined whether their multi-million-dollar redevelopment project could proceed. One executive nervously apologized for not recognizing him sooner. William smiled gently and replied without bitterness, "You recognized exactly what you chose to see." Those simple words carried more weight than any accusation ever could. Emily Brooks, who had quietly entered the room after hearing about the unexpected visitor, felt tears forming in her eyes. She remembered every conversation she had shared with William outside the bank, every cup of coffee, every piece of quiet wisdom he had offered without revealing who he truly was. Suddenly, everything made sense. The businessman who had saluted him, the white rose placed on the steps each year, the promise he refused to break, the mysterious envelope. None of it had ever been about money. It had always been about keeping the commitment he made to Margaret Hayes. Richard Collins gathered himself and carefully presented the development company's offer. He explained the financial benefits, the projected growth, and the extraordinary purchase price awaiting William Hayes if he agreed to sell. When he finished speaking, the room became completely silent once again. Every person waited for William's response. Slowly, the elderly veteran reached into the inside pocket of his military jacket and removed a faded photograph of Margaret Hayes. He looked at it for several quiet moments before placing it gently on the table beside the contract. Then he looked around the room, meeting the eyes of every executive one by one. His expression showed neither anger nor satisfaction, only quiet conviction. Finally, he spoke. "Before I decide the future of this building, there is something every one of you deserves to hear. Because this property was never the most valuable thing my wife and I built together." With those words, William Hayes began telling a story that no amount of money could ever buy. A story so powerful that by the time he finished, every person in that boardroom would question everything they believed about wealth, success, and the true meaning of legacy. William Hayes let the silence linger for several moments before he spoke again. Every person in the room leaned forward, no longer interested in contracts or financial projections. They wanted to understand the man they had overlooked for so many years. William gently picked up the faded photograph of Margaret Hayes and smiled, not with happiness, but with gratitude. "My wife used to tell me that buildings don't change communities," he began quietly. "People do." He explained how he and Margaret had never purchased the property to become wealthy. They had invested in it because they believed stable businesses created stable neighborhoods, and stable neighborhoods gave ordinary families a chance to build better lives. Every lease payment the bank had made over the years had helped support that vision. But after Margaret passed away, William no longer measured the property's value by the amount of money it generated. Every dollar became a tool to honor the promise he had made to her. Through the Hayes Family Trust, anonymous donations quietly paid medical bills for struggling veterans, provided scholarships for military families, helped widows remain in their homes, and funded local food banks during difficult winters. No one knew where the money came from because William never wanted recognition. He wasn't interested in having his name printed on plaques or buildings. He believed that kindness accomplished its greatest purpose when it expected nothing in return. As the executives listened, they slowly realized that the elderly veteran sitting before them had spent years changing lives while allowing the world to believe he had nothing himself. Richard Collins lowered his eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of what he was hearing. He remembered every complaint he had received about William Hayes sitting outside the bank. He remembered discussions about asking security to remove him. He remembered walking past him hundreds of times without introducing himself. Suddenly, none of those memories felt small. They felt shameful. One by one, the executives around the table experienced the same uncomfortable realization. They had spent years evaluating William based entirely on appearances, never imagining that the man wearing a faded military jacket possessed greater wealth of character than many of them had accumulated during entire careers. Charles Bennett quietly placed several financial statements on the conference table. They showed that William Hayes had every legal right to accept the development company's multimillion-dollar offer. The amount would secure generations of financial security, even though William had no immediate family left to inherit it. Every eye returned to William, waiting for his decision. The development firm's representatives politely reminded him that the proposal would modernize the city and generate substantial economic growth. They emphasized the extraordinary purchase price, explaining that opportunities like this rarely appeared. William listened respectfully without interrupting. When they finished, he folded his hands together and looked toward the large conference room window overlooking the street, where his weathered bench remained visible below. "Tell me something," he said calmly. "When this building is gone, where will the tellers work? Where will the maintenance staff go? What happens to the families who depend on these jobs? What happens to the small cafe across the street that survives because bank employees buy coffee there every morning?" Progress should never come at the expense of people who trusted us. The room became completely silent. For the first time, the discussion was no longer about profits. It was about responsibility. Emily Brooks felt tears forming as she watched William speak with quiet conviction. She finally understood why he had spent 15 years sitting outside the bank instead of hiding behind lawyers or wealth. He wanted to remain connected to the people whose lives were affected by the decisions made inside those walls. He wanted to remember Margaret Hayes every day by protecting the community they had built together. After several long moments, William reached for the purchase agreement resting in front of him. Every executive watched closely, expecting him either to sign or reject it outright. Instead, he slowly closed the folder and slid it back across the table. "I'm not interested in selling," he said softly. "But that doesn't mean this story ends today." The executives exchanged confused looks. If William refused to sell, why did he seem so calm? Then he looked directly at Richard Collins and added words that no one expected to hear. "I have a different proposal. One that could protect every employee in this building, strengthen this community, and honor the promise I made to Margaret Hayes. Whether it happens now depends entirely on whether you're willing to value people more than profit." At that moment, every person in the room realized the meeting they thought would end with a signature was only the beginning of a decision that would transform far more than a single building. The silence inside the conference room lasted far longer than anyone expected. Richard Collins looked around the table, hoping someone else would respond first, but no words came. Every executive had entered the meeting believing they were negotiating a real estate transaction. Instead, they found themselves confronting questions about integrity, responsibility, and the true purpose of success. William Hayes remained remarkably calm. He wasn't interested in embarrassing anyone. He wasn't seeking revenge for the years people had ignored him. He had spent too much of his life carrying grief to waste what remained on bitterness. After allowing the room to gather itself, he slowly stood and walked toward the large window overlooking the entrance of Ashford National Bank. From there, he could see the weathered bench where he had spent thousands of mornings honoring the promise he had made to Margaret Hayes. He rested one hand on the glass before turning back toward the executives. "My wife believed every business has two balance sheets," he said quietly. "One records profits. The other records lives changed. Most companies protect the first one. Very few protect the second." Those words settled over the room with unexpected force. For the first time in years, Richard Collins found himself thinking less about quarterly reports and more about the people whose names never appeared in them. William Hayes then revealed the proposal he had spent months preparing. Instead of selling the property to the development company, he intended to transfer ownership of the building into a newly established charitable trust that would permanently preserve Ashford National Bank as a community institution, provided the bank agreed to several conditions. No employee would lose a job because of redevelopment. Veterans returning from military service would receive hiring opportunities and financial education programs. A portion of the building would be renovated into a free community resource center offering career counseling, housing assistance, and legal support for military families, widows, and individuals struggling to rebuild their lives. Small local businesses leasing space on the property would receive affordable long-term agreements instead of being forced out by rising rents. William explained that the bank would continue operating successfully, but its success would now be measured by something larger than shareholder returns. It would become a place where people left with hope instead of simply financial transactions. Charles Bennett placed another folder on the table containing every legal document required to make the plan a reality. The executives carefully examined the proposal. Financially, it was far less profitable than selling the building. Morally, it was impossible to ignore. Richard Collins slowly removed his glasses and looked toward William Hayes with genuine emotion. His voice was quieter than anyone in the room had ever heard it. He admitted that during his entire career, he had believed leadership meant maximizing profits and satisfying investors. He confessed that he had walked past William hundreds of times without ever wondering about the man behind the worn military jacket. Looking back, he realized that he had judged character by appearance and value by financial statements. The other executives shared similar feelings. Some openly apologized for the assumptions they had made over the years. Emily Brooks listened silently, remembering William's words from outside the bank. Never judge someone's final chapter by the clothes they're wearing. Only now did everyone understand what he had meant. William accepted every apology with quiet grace, never mentioning the complaints, the suspicious glances, or the time security had asked him to leave. Instead, he simply smiled and said, "The greatest gift we can give one another isn't forgiveness. It's the willingness to see each other clearly before it's too late." Later that afternoon, after hours of discussion, Ashford National Bank's board voted unanimously to reject the multi-million-dollar redevelopment deal and accept William Hayes' proposal instead. News of the decision spread quickly throughout the city. Employees who had spent days fearing layoffs embraced one another in relief. Veterans organizations learned about the planned community center. Local business owners discovered they would be allowed to remain where they had built their livelihoods for years. Reporters rushed to uncover the identity of the mysterious property owner whose decision had changed everything. Within days, newspapers across the country were telling the remarkable story of the elderly veteran who had quietly owned one of the city's most valuable buildings while living a life of extraordinary humility. But William Hayes showed little interest in interviews or headlines. He had accomplished what he promised Margaret Hayes he would do. He had protected the people who depended on the building, just as she had hoped. Yet there was still one final chapter left to unfold. One final decision that would reveal the true measure of William Hayes' character and leave an entire community remembering his name for generations to come. In the weeks that followed, Ashford National Bank became known for something far more valuable than financial success. Construction crews didn't arrive to demolish the building. Instead, they arrived to restore it. Empty offices were transformed into classrooms where veterans learned new career skills after returning home. A section of the first floor became a resource center where military families received financial guidance, legal assistance, and support during difficult times. Small business owners who had feared losing everything signed long-term leases that allowed them to remain part of the neighborhood they had helped build. The little coffee shop across the street continued serving customers every morning, its owner never knowing just how close the business had come to disappearing forever. Employees who once worried about losing their jobs now walked into work with a different sense of purpose. Richard Collins often reminded new hires that they weren't simply working in a bank. They were serving a community built on the values of one man who believed character mattered more than profit. Emily Brooks accepted William Hayes' invitation to help oversee the Hayes Community Foundation, ensuring that Margaret Hayes' vision would continue long after both of them were gone. What began as one elderly veteran keeping a promise had quietly grown into something that touched thousands of lives. Although newspapers across the country continued asking for interviews, William Hayes politely declined every request. Television producers offered to tell his story. Publishers wanted to write books about the mysterious veteran who secretly owned one of the city's most valuable properties. Business schools asked him to deliver speeches about leadership. He turned them all down. Fame had never interested him. Recognition had never been his goal. Every morning, he continued following the same routine that had puzzled the city for 15 years. He arrived before sunrise, sat quietly on the familiar weathered bench across from Ashford National Bank, greeted people with the same gentle smile, and watched employees unlock the front doors. The only difference now was that people no longer walked past without noticing him. Children stopped to shake his hand. Veterans saluted him with quiet respect. Bank employees greeted him by name before starting their day. Customers often sat beside him for a few moments, not because they wanted anything from him, but because they valued the peace that seemed to surround him. Yet William never behaved as though anything had changed. To him, the attention belonged not to himself, but to the promise he and Margaret Hayes had made together many years earlier. Whenever someone thanked him for saving the building, he would simply smile and reply, "Promises only matter if someone keeps them." One crisp autumn morning, nearly a year after the meeting that changed everything, Emily Brooks arrived earlier than usual carrying 2 cups of coffee. She smiled as she crossed the street toward William's bench, expecting to find him waiting as he always did. But the bench was empty. At first she assumed he was running late, something that had never happened before. Then she noticed a neatly folded American flag resting on the bench beside a small envelope with her name written across the front. Her hands trembled as she opened the letter. Inside was a brief message written in William Hayes' careful handwriting. Dear Emily, if you're reading this, it means I've finally kept every promise I made. Thank you for seeing a person when others only saw appearances. Never stop believing that kindness changes lives, even when nobody notices. Take care of this place for Margaret, for Benjamin, and for every person still searching for hope. With gratitude, William Hayes. Emily looked toward the rising sun, with tears filling her eyes. William had passed away peacefully during the night in his small apartment, leaving behind no mansion, no luxury cars, and no fortune spent on himself. Instead, he left schools, scholarships, homes rebuilt, veterans helped, families protected, businesses saved, and a community forever changed by quiet compassion. Perhaps the greatest surprise was never that William Hayes owned the building. The greatest surprise was that he never allowed ownership to own him. He spent years sitting outside Ashford National Bank, while people judged him by worn clothes instead of quiet character, never correcting their assumptions because he understood something many people never learn. A person's greatest wealth is rarely visible. It lives in promises kept, lives changed, sacrifices made, and kindness offered without expecting recognition. William once believed he was protecting a building, but in the end, he realized he had been protecting something far more valuable. He had protected the values his wife Margaret Hayes believed could still exist in the world. And perhaps that's the lesson hidden inside his remarkable story. The next time you pass someone the world has chosen to overlook, remember William Hayes. Because the person sitting quietly beside you may be carrying a story greater than anything appearances could ever reveal. And the greatest legacy any of us will leave behind will never be measured by what we owned, but by the people whose lives became better simply because we were here, ... William Hayes' story reminds us that the people we overlook today may be carrying burdens we cannot see, promises we cannot imagine, and a strength that never asks for recognition. He never measured his life by the size of his bank account, the title on a business card, or the applause of strangers. Instead, he measured it by every veteran who found hope, every family that stayed together, every employee who kept a job, and every promise he kept to the woman he loved. In a world that often encourages us to judge people by appearances, William chose a different path. He showed us that true greatness is quiet. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't need to announce itself. It simply continues doing what is right, even when nobody is watching. Perhaps that's why so many people walked past him for years without realizing they were standing beside one of the wealthiest men in the city. His greatest fortune was never the building he owned. It was the life he lived. As you leave this story today, take a moment to think about the people you encounter every day. The elderly man sitting alone on a park bench. The quiet woman working the late shift. The veteran standing silently in line at the grocery store. The janitor cleaning an office after everyone else has gone home. Every person you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about. Every face has a history. Every life has chapters hidden from public view. Sometimes the greatest act of kindness isn't giving someone money. Sometimes it's giving them dignity. Sometimes it's taking a moment to listen instead of assuming you already know their story. William Hayes changed an entire community not because he possessed extraordinary wealth, but because he possessed extraordinary compassion. He understood that people remember how you made them feel long after they've forgotten what you owned. So before we say goodbye, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever met someone whose story completely changed the way you judge people? Have you ever experienced a moment that reminded you never to judge a book by its cover? Share your thoughts in the comments below because your story may encourage someone else who needs hope today. If William Hayes' journey touched your heart, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful documentary-style stories that reveal the extraordinary lives hidden behind ordinary faces. Thank you for spending this time with us. Until next time, remember this simple truth. Character is revealed when no one is looking. Kindness is remembered long after wealth is forgotten. And the greatest legacy you will ever leave behind is not what you owned, but the lives you chose to lift along the way.